Welcome to Photoactive, a podcast about photography and technology. I'm Kirk McElhearn.
And I'm Jeff Carlson.
This week, we want to talk about something that everyone thinks they know a lot about, and that's sensors and megapixels in cameras, in smartphones. And we're happy to have Richard Butler with us. Richard Butler is technical editor for DPReview. Richard, thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me on.
I find it interesting that you're from the country I live in and living in the country I used to live in. And we've had several people like that on this show. Why does DPReview have so many British people?
Well, DPReview, I think, was founded in Singapore. But then when we expanded, it was based in London. So there was a lot of recruitment while we were based in London.
Right.
And then when we relocated to Seattle, it was too good a job to give up. So a lot of us moved with the company.
Okay. How do you like it there?
Well, I mean, the weather's pretty much the same as back home. So, all of my wardrobe worked. It was about as seamless as it could be, trying to cross between the two cultures.
Okay. So the obvious question is, with sensors, is bigger better?
I mean, generally, yes, absolutely.
Okay,
See,
well, thank you very much, Richard. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. No, the question comes up because I'm going to go back, and I'm not sure how many years ago this was, when Apple, I think Phil Schiller introduced one of the new iPhones. He said, the megapixels don't matter, bigger pixels matter. And my thought was like, dude, you're doing the marketing spin, because I was saying before the show to Jeff that the iPhone with only 12 megapixels is really problematic now, given the quality of the photos that they can make, because you don't have any headroom for cropping. And there's rumors that they'll have a 48 megapixel sensor in the next iPhone. I don't know if they'll jump from 12 to 48. But are Apple's bigger pixels better than someone else's normal size pixels?
Well, I think it's quite interesting to draw a line between smartphone sensors, which are absolutely tiny, and the sensors in most consumer cameras, whether it's 1-inch sensors in an RX100 or, anything bigger than that all the way up to sort of medium format. The pixels in smartphone sensors tend to be absolutely tiny. And when you get down to that kind of scale, then there is some benefit to having larger pixels, simply because you're dealing with so little light that anything you can do to capture that bit more is just going to help overcome noise and produce a better image. So it's a slightly different story when you're talking a big camera versus a smartphone.
So is it just that we're to the point where next time there's a bigger sensor that comes out, we should upgrade our cameras? Jeff and I both shoot Fujifilm, and I have an X-T3 and an X-T4. They both have the 26 megapixel sensor. Jeff, you upgraded from an X-T2 to the X-T1 to X-T3?
An X-T1 to an X-T3. So I think I went from 16 to 26 or 24 or something like that. And, while I had the X-T1, my general take was, it's perfectly fine. I've made some very nice images with it. I'm not desperate for more megapixels. And the way these things work, once I had more megapixels, I was like, oh, well, actually, this is really nice. I think there was maybe one time when I was shooting and really noticed the fact that my X-T1 was older and having fewer megapixels just didn't let me do some of the editing that I wanted. And so, now I feel like I'm still in that camp of, well, I have 26 megapixels and I can crop and I can do all sorts of good things like that. So I'm just fine where I am. And then I look over at the Fuji GX100S, which is 100 megapixels, and there's a little part of me that says, oh, but wouldn't that be nice? I don't know if it's $6,000 nice, but, And then there's that whole range in between where you're like, okay, it's not like I'm making bad images now because I don't have enough megapixels. But, what would 100 megapixels give me? And, do I even need to focus on all this because it can be so obsessive? Sorry, there wasn't a question there.
No, I mean, I think that you've sort of cut to the heart of the things I have to think about every day. I've just finished reviewing the GFX 100S, and I have to say, a sensor that big and 100 megapixels is a wonderful combination. I mean, you can keep zooming into the image, and it's just so full of detail. And what's lovely is if you shoot more megapixels and downsize it, you'll still have more detail than if you just shot at the resolution you're downsizing to. So even if because a lot of people say, well, why would I even need 100 megapixels? I was fine when I had 12 or 16. The answer is, you don't need it. Nobody, almost nobody, I'm not going to say nobody needs it. Almost nobody needs 100 megapixels. But once you've started shooting that way and you've realized how much you can crop in and how much detail remains, even when you don't, whatever size you're using it at, it's lovely to have. And then it's got a big sensor, so it's capturing so much light. So your tonal quality is just beautiful. It's very hard to step back from having used that camera to using anything, slightly more every day. But as you say, it's $6,000. And what I'd say is, while you have a camera and are shooting with it and are enjoying it, don't worry about it. The time to worry about should I worry about a bigger sensor? Should I worry about more megapixels? Is when your camera dies, or you find yourself with a bit of money and think, oh, maybe it's time to upgrade. But in between, don't worry about it. It's not going to it's not in and of itself going to make your photography better. So I spend a lot of my I spend all my life writing advice for people who are thinking of upgrading. But that doesn't mean, if you're happy with your camera, that should prompt you to upgrade. They're two different things.
Also, I don't want to get too far afield, but when I think of a 100 megapixel sensor, that also makes me realize that I need to make sure I have a machine that can handle that on the other side. Because, yay, it's great to have a giant image, but, each image is like the file size has got to be just massive.
Well, it's probably 4 times the raw files we have, which are about 50 megabytes. So it's probably about 200 megabytes. I would say just buy the cheapest M1 Mac and you won't have any problems.
That would be a good test.
Until you try uploading them. We have an image sample gallery that people can download, and sitting on my rather clunky home Wi-Fi trying to get 200 megabyte raw files to upload. That was a long and very tedious afternoon, just thinking, okay, the rest of the review's ready. I just, come on, keep uploading, keep uploading. But
how far are you from the office? Because it might be easier to just hop on a bike and take a USB stick.
That's true. Well, I'd need quite a big USB stick. That's one of the things I'm looking forward to about being able to go back into the office one day, is having, non-hamster powered internet.
Yeah.
I'm just looking at the image sensor format page on Wikipedia. So we're talking about APS-C on Fuji, and also, I guess, Nikon, Sony, Canon. They all have similar sized sensors. And the medium format that they give as an example, a Kodak sensor, is 4 times the size. Is the 100 megapixel sensor 4 times the size of the 26 megapixel sensor, or are the pixels larger or smaller?
Actually, in this case, they are almost certainly exactly the same pixels. Sony Semiconductor makes a series of sensors all based around the same pixel size. And if you look at the pixel count of the X-T4 against its sensor size, the Sony A7R4 with its 61 megapixels, and then the Fujifilm GFX 100s with 100 megapixels, and actually even the Phase 1 IQ4s, if you've got tens of thousands of dollars to spend, they've got an even larger sensor, 150 megapixels. They've all got essentially the same pixels in them. So they're
the same pixel density.
Same pixel density. And one of the guys in our science forum has looked really closely at the noise pattern of the GFX 100. You can actually essentially see the join between the 4 sensors. It is pretty much literally 4 APS-C sensors.
It's 4 sensors rather than one big sensor.
Yeah, it's very hard to fab a sensor that big reliably. So you stitch them together.
Oh, okay. Okay. And it also has I think the GFX 100 has a pixel shift thing, so you can make a 200 megapixel photo, which a lot of cameras can do that, right?
Yes.
So you can get the megapixels without the sensor, but everything has to be like perfectly still, doesn't it?
Pretty much, yeah. Because what you're doing is you're you're taking a photo, shifting the sensor by half a pixel width, then taking another photo, then moving it up by half a pixel width, taking another photo, moving it to the right by half a pixel. All of that takes time. And actually, the bigger the sensor, generally the longer it takes to read out. So the longer gap you have to leave between each of those photos. So those techniques actually work better for smartphones and smaller sensors than they do for large ones, which is why at the beginning when I said generally bigger is better, the very small sensors in smartphones plus quite a lot of processing power plus the seemingly unlimited R&D budgets of companies like Apple, you can actually squeeze an awful lot out of small sensors if you do things like taking multiple photos, one after another, intelligently blend them together. You get the same image quality benefits as you would using a large sensor to take a single photo. So there are ways around it. And I was interested that you said there was speculation about Apple going to 48 and that's quite a big jump from 12.
But it's four times 12.
And there are definitely sensors out there that use essentially enlarged versions of the Bayer pattern spreading over 4 pixels, which means you can do all sorts of things in terms of sort of phase detection, and you can produce you can produce a low noise 12 megapixel image by binning the pixels together, or you can produce a high resolution image by treating them separately. So yeah, I think that sounds pretty plausible to me.
In fact, that would be typical Apple to come out with this thing. We've got this thing where it takes 4 pictures at the same time, a half a pixel apart, and puts them together with 14 trillion operations per second. That's the kind of marketing.
And make it sound like they invented it.
Yes, that too. Just one thing, Jeff. If you're thinking of upgrading to the GFX, don't forget you have to buy all new lenses too.
Oh, I know. That's also a consideration where I'm like, yeah, my X-T3 is going great. I'm fine with it for now because I would have to get all new lenses.
For cameras like these, do we have the largest sensor that the cameras can hold now? The 26 megapixel.
The mount, the X mount that Fujifilm uses, does appear to be designed around APS-C. So you'd struggle to fit a full frame sensor in there, and then and of course you then have to develop a whole new set of lenses, even if you stayed within the same mount. A lot of brands talk about, there's an upgrade path.
Oh, you'd have to have new lenses because the distance between the sensor and the lens changes. So the crop factor changes, or is it the size of the sensor that changes the crop factor?
The size of the sensor would change the crop factor, but frankly, most of the lenses built for the X mount at the moment, they project an image circle that's only a little bit bigger than APS-C. So even if you put a full frame sensor in there, you wouldn't be able to light the corners of it. So you'd need to make a series of full frame lenses for X mount, just as on Sony's E mount, you have some lenses only work on APS-C, and then the FE ones cover the full frame sensor.
So are companies like Fuji going down a dead end now for the future?
It depends on how you look at it. If you see full frame as being, the only format anyone should care about, then perhaps.
No, I'm thinking more. They went from 18 to 24 to 26. They're not going to be able to go to 32, right? Well, that's what I'm asking. With the same lenses.
Oh, absolutely. So you can't go to a larger sensor necessarily, but as pixel technologies improve, there's no reason you couldn't go to finer pixels. At a certain point, you'll start to get diminishing returns because your lenses may not resolve that many megapixels. Diffraction will limit the absolute sharpness you can ever achieve. But as I say, the pixels off the top of my head, are they 2.76 or 3.76 microns? But smartphones, it's
too much information.
I knew. But essentially, they're sort of 2.5, 3 times bigger than the typical pixels in most smartphones. They're vast by smartphone standards. So there's plenty of scope for them to be downsized and still perform well. I think I have to assume we'll see it.
I've always wondered, lenses are round, right? They project a circle of light. Wouldn't it make more sense to have a square sensor than a rectangular sensor. I mean, the rectangular sensor is obviously adopted because of the 35 millimeter format, but wouldn't it make more sense to have a square sensor? And like Hasselblad, do they have a square sensor in their digital cameras?
I can't think of anyone who's using a square sensor at the moment. I mean, obviously, the optimal format would be to have a circular sensor, and that way you could crop it in any direction. But of course, you know your photo frames would then just roll around all over the place. It'd be a disaster. Yeah. But lots of people do propose the idea of a square sensor. I guess the question is, how often would you use the whole region? Because if you're always going to take a crop, and you know, most people are taking 3:2 or 4:3 images, occasionally 16:9. You know, sensor real estate is expensive. So to have all that additional sensor top and bottom that you're not using for, you know, whatever proportion of your photos, that's quite an expensive luxury. Then of course you've made the sensor bigger, so you've made it heavier, and that means that it's harder to apply image stabilization because you develop inertia.
Right.
So it could be done. There's certainly an appeal to it. You know, you never have to turn the camera into the portrait format because you can just you know, crop it to that later. But I think it would be expensive, and I'm not sure enough people would commit to the cost to make it worthwhile.
What percentage of the cost of a camera is the sensor?
If I knew, I'd have published it by now. It's something manufacturers keep very close to their chest.
Does it cost $50, $100, $200? What do you think?
I'm not the person to ask.
Yeah, because when you look at, you've got multiple cameras with the same sensor, right? And they can range from maybe $500 up to a couple thousand with the same sensor. So it can't be that expensive. But it's not just the sensor. It's the computational stuff behind it. It's the computer that's connected to the sensor that's expensive.
Yeah, I mean, probably not in and of itself, but the R&D that's had to go into it.
Right.
And if you think about how few cameras you sell in comparison to how many iPhones you sell, you know, you've got a relatively small audience that you have to claw that money back from. But part of it is, simply that, you know, economics works on the basis of how much is the customer willing to pay. You know, you don't sell a product for the amount it costs you to make it plus a profit margin necessarily. So, you know, you put the highest end features in your top model, and people are willing to spend more for it. So you cut some of those out for the mid-level model, and then you cut even more out, and you probably don't make much profit on your lowest end model, and you know, you segment the market. And you know, that can seem incredibly cynical, especially if, you know, if you're somebody who wants the highest end features and you know the technology exists in the middle level model, and you think, well, they could just give them to me,
or they could just turn them on in the firmware or whatever.
Absolutely, it feels incredibly cynical.
Yeah.
But if you are the kind of customer who might buy the most expensive model, and you can get away without having to pay for it, well, who's paying for the R&D? Who's paying for the company's profit margin? Which unfortunately is how all of this works.
So I want to talk about the camera I lust after. I've mentioned it many times on this show. It's the Leica M monochrome. And the sensor in that is totally different. Can you explain why the Leica M monochrome has such incredible detail compared to other cameras?
Well, quite simply, it's because it's not trying to capture color. So all the other cameras we're talking about, whether it's the X-Trans color filter pattern in front of a sensor in a Fujifilm, or the conventional Bayer pattern, what all of them are doing is they're capturing either red, green, or blue. There are some other variations, but they're capturing one of the three primaries at each photodiode, and then they're having to interpolate. They're having to calculate what the values of the other two primary colors would be at that location, unless you use pixel shift, in which case you may well try and capture a red, a green, and blue for each location. You get lovely detail. The monochrome doesn't have to do that. Because it's only capturing black and white, you don't put any color filter in front of the sensor, so you're not having to basically blur the image by calculating pixel values based on its neighbors. You can just directly take each capture photodiode equals an output pixel. So there's no demosaicing, and there's no blurring, therefore coming from the demosaicing. So you get this incredible pixel level resolution. It's exactly the same thing that Sigma fovean sensors do, and that's why there's such a loyal fan base for that kind of sensor, because you're capturing all your detail at a single pixel, and you're not having to derive any of it from its neighbors.
So does that mean that I think the Leica M monochrome is like a 24 megapixel, or no, it's actually a 40 megapixel now, isn't it? The latest one. Does that mean that it's really like a 160 megapixel sensor, or 120 or something? Because if you're blurring everything on a normal 40 megapixel sensor, and here you're not, is that what makes the detail?
I'd certainly say it has. You can certainly say it has a higher perceptual resolution than you'd usually get from a 40 megapixel camera. It becomes very complex if you then try to use megapixels as your metric for discussing, because it
Right.
literally is 40 megapixels. So but it has a resolution equivalent to a higher resolution sensor with a Bayer pattern on it.
Or the sensor with the Bayer pattern has a resolution that's lower than the number of megapixels it has. Probably better to look at it like that.
Yeah, that's probably fair.
So our 26, well, we have an X-trans in the Fuji cameras. It's similar. Our 26 megapixel, they're a resolution like 16 then, because of all the interpolation?
As I say, I don't think you can use the same metric to mean two different things. I mean, it is 26 megapixels. You've captured data at 26 million points, and you're representing it at 26 million points. If you think in terms of let's not go into video color spaces.
No, definitely not.
Let me catch myself there.
Sure.
So probably a fairer way of saying it is you certainly have luminance resolution of 26 megapixels. So you've got brightness, which pretty closely in human vision equates to detail. You've represented the scene with 26 million pixels. However, you haven't captured color you haven't captured full color at every pixel, and so your chroma, your color layer, isn't as high resolution as your luminance layer.
Right.
But then you get into the fact that the green layer is higher resolution than the red and the blue layer, and so it becomes quite a headache quite quickly. But for all its faults, Bayer does a really good job of striking that balance between detail capture and chroma detail capture. And humans actually aren't particularly great at interpreting, chroma detail. If you're to look at a fovean sensor image and a Bayer sensor image side by side, they don't look radically different until you zoom in. When you get into the pixel level, definitely the fovean one will be sharper. But if you saw it in a print, I'm not sure the degree to which you'd see that difference.
But you could print larger.
Yes, probably. Assuming the same pixel count for both cameras.
Right.
I have another question that it's one of those things that I sort of know the technical behind it, but I've not looked into it enough to really be like, oh, yes, this is exactly how it works. A lot of cameras are now coming out with stacked sensors for either higher resolution or focusing. And basically, can you explain what a stacked sensor is? Because my mental model has always been there's a square bit of electronics and the light hits that and it gets saved and there you go. But of course, that's not really what's going on, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, to a great extent, that's exactly what's going on.
Okay, good.
Stacked CMOS is, it can mean all sorts of things because it's basically a fabrication technology. The first CMOS sensors were known as front side illuminated, and generally you'd etch the photosensitive element, and then you'd etch the wiring on the top, and then that's your sensor. Mm-hmm. Then the next generation was backside illuminated sensors, where you did exactly the same thing, but you then shave it off the silicon that you've built it up on, flip the chip over, and then and now all of a sudden your photosensitive element is at the front and your wiring is at the back. So that's BSI sensor. So that's one of the improvements between your XT1 and your XT3, is the move from front side illuminated to back side illuminated. Stacked just takes this one generation further, and instead of just slicing off your entire sensor, it just slices off a single layer of circuitry. And then you can fabricate another one and slice that off. Then you can fabricate another one and slice that off, and perfectly align them and essentially glue them together. It's a way of making sort of finer and more sophisticated circuitry without each layer being in competition with one another as you're building it up. So most of the stacked CMOS sensors we're seeing are essentially photodiode at the front, some circuitry at the back, and then behind that some DRAM. So they can read out super fast, and then they've got this huge cache of very, very fast memory, very, very close to the chip, which is why the Sony A1 and A9 are so quick, because they've got somewhere that they can just throw the data to and then start reading again or start doing something else. It allows them to be run much faster. But I know there are companies working on, okay, well, let's have the front of the sensor be sensitive, just conventional red, green, blue. Then let's have an infrared layer behind that, or at least I think that's what's going on. But it's more a fabrication technology. You can then design all sorts of different things as you come up with clever ideas of what to do with it. So in and of itself, the phrase stacked CMOS doesn't tell us a lot. It's what you then do with the technology.
Okay, so
it's marketing.
Well, so like
it makes it sound special.
Is it an efficiency thing? So you can just pump out a lot more data? Because I know that's obviously an issue when we get into larger sensors, is that image data has to travel from the sensor to the storage and refresh, so you can, not have to wait a long time between each shot. Or is it a focusing mechanism, or is the stacking just a technique and then they can do various things with it?
So yes, stacking is the manufacturing technique.
Okay.
It requires incredible precision. If you think about how big a silicon chip is, if you then imagine having to shave, these incredibly tiny, with maybe 50 million individual elements on each one.
Yeah.
The idea of shaving a layer off and then aligning it perfectly to another layer of silicon that's also etched with 50 million details on it and lining them up precisely. They end up being very expensive. That's certainly why a lot of cameras with big stacked sensors are expensive. But as you say, it's basically a technique that you can do multiple things with. What we've seen so far, certainly in large sensors, has been all about fast readout. And if you can read out the sensor quickly, and your phase detection phase detection information, your autofocus information is coming from the pixels, then the quicker you can read them out, the quicker you can interpret the results and cause the autofocus to respond to that, and then get an update on how well it's done, and then you can do that feedback loop so much quicker. So it ends up improving focus, but only as a sort of byproduct of its readout speed.
So basically, bigger is better. Buy what you can afford to buy, and we should probably just not worry about geeking out about all these fancy new technologies for sensors, because one day we're going to wake up and they're going to announce the 500 megapixel sensor, and it's going to cost peanuts, and it's going to be one of those leaps. But until then, it's incremental, and just get what we can. We don't necessarily need the huge sensor.
Absolutely. Bigger is better in the sense that it can offer you better image quality, but it also tends to mean that the lenses are bigger, and the lenses consequently tend to be more expensive,
and heavier.
Yeah, and heavier. And
and that's one of the advantages of mirrorless cameras, that they're so much lighter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if what you're trying to do is travel with something and have a camera that's always with you, bigger may not be better. In that moment where you're taking the photo, the biggest sensor you can have with you will generally take the better photo. But if you haven't got the bigger camera with you because you couldn't be bothered to drag it around with you, or you were worried about carrying thousands of dollars worth of gear around wherever it is you are, well, it hasn't taken the better picture because you haven't got it with you. So I have to say, if I was buying a camera tomorrow, I'd probably end up, in the APS-C camp, just because I really like the X-T4. There's a really nice selection of lenses that are suited to its sensor size. The lenses that I'd want to use exist, and I don't. I've also got a bike buying habit and a suit buying habit to support, and I can't. Money is not no object. So for me, actually, APS-C strikes a good balance of image quality, portability, and price.
The medium format is really for professionals or people who do a lot of landscape photos and want the best resolution.
Broadly speaking, but it's also for anyone who just thinks, this is the hobby I love. I want to be sure that it's not my gear that's holding me back. Certainly that's the way I buy bikes. I have my racing bike is many, many times better than I need because I don't race and I was terrible when I tried. I never want it to be the bike that's holding me back. It's I don't mind it being my fitness. I don't mind it being my my commitment. But I don't want my gear being the thing that's stopping me being better.
Haven't we reached the point where every camera is good enough? I mean, go back to when digital cameras were 4 or 8 megapixels, and that was limiting. And now at 18, 24, 26 or whatever, or full frame, it's good enough.
Oh, I think we've long ago passed good enough. We're now into, do I want better? Back to what Jeff said earlier. You don't think you need more megapixels, and then you experience it and go, oh, actually, that's lovely. That said, all the super resolution processing that Adobe's coming out with, and I know other brands, have got something similar. One thing I'm hoping to do over the next couple of weeks is dig out some of my first digital photos, which were a whole 6 megapixels, and there were a couple of them that didn't look great when I printed them as large as I wanted to print them, and I really want to see what happens if I throw modern raw processing algorithms and then super resolution at them, and I'm tempted to even print it because I think somewhere I've got a print I did back in sort of the early 2000s. I'd love to compare them side by side and see how much I can squeeze out of the same really not very good super zoom camera from 20 years ago.
Yeah. I think I have a Palm Trio somewhere, or sorry, images from a Palm Trio somewhere. See what that does. No. That was really, 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 really bad at the time. That was a cell phone sensor that was even, I don't even, like 2 megapixels or something crazy. But yeah.
Okay, Richard, thank you very much for joining us. Richard Butler from DPReview. I think most people will have understood that they don't really need to spend the money on the better camera. I've always felt it's better to spend money on lenses because you have more possibilities with new lenses than you do with a new camera.
Yeah, absolutely. So long as we're going through a period where everybody's moving to new mounts, whether that's X or E, but even Canon and Nikon are making that move across to completely new mounts, which are to some degree back compatible. So the idea that lenses are forever and bodies are transient isn't quite as true as it used to be. But yeah, ultimately, a good lens will work across multiple generations of body, and frankly, it's much. You're going to be in a much better state having the perfect lens for the job you're trying to do, rather than go, well, I've still got my same collection of lenses, but I've got a new camera body, and that's not going to help you.
That makes me think we'll invite you back in a couple of months to talk about lenses, about the technology behind lenses.
I'll have to do a bit of brushing up, but I'd love to.
Okay, thanks for joining us, Richard.
Thanks so much.
Cheers.
Okay, it's time for our snapshots. What have you got, Jeff?
I've got something that I'm going to recommend without having seen it, but, it's sort of topical. I noticed that there's a new show on Hulu called Exposure, and it's one of these reality competition shows. So automatic, you're like, and it's a camera focused one. So it's a bunch of photographers competing. And again, I'm like, but it looks as if they're only using phones. They're only using smartphone cameras, which kind of ratchets up the difficulty in a huge way. Now, again, I haven't seen it as we record this. There are only 2 episodes that have been released. But the fact that they would make a show just based around camera phone shooting is really interesting. So I'm definitely going to have to check this out. So it's just called Exposure. It's on Hulu. And I would assume that there's probably some sort of prize and that the winner doesn't just get exposure. What's your snapshot this week?
I have a collection of videos about photographers, masters of photography that does a bunch of what they call masterclass video courses. And I mentioned the one early in this podcast by Joel Meyerowitz that I watched. They have a webpage with a couple dozen videos organized about photographers. And just looking from the bottom, Robert Frank, Irving Penn, Andre Kertész, Alfred Stieglitz, Cartier-Bresson, Deanne Arbus, David Yarrow, William Eggleston, Gordon Parks, Edward Weston, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They basically just collated a bunch of YouTube videos and put them on one page. And I think this is a great curated page for anyone who's interested in learning more about photographers. The only problem is a lot of the videos are really low resolution, which means they were probably put on YouTube a long time ago, and some of them are like 240p or 360p.
Oh.
Some are better. Some are from TV channels. There's a couple an hour long. Some are a half hour. But just flip through it, and you'll find a number of interesting photographers. And I like these documentaries about photographers. I find it interesting to learn about the photographers and their photography.
Definitely.
Okay, that's enough for this week. Until next time.
See you next time.
Thanks for listening to Photoactive. You can find show notes, including any photos we discuss in this episode, at photoactive.co. That's photoactive.co. We couldn't afford the M. You can join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/photoactivecast. That's photoactivecast in one word. You can subscribe to Photoactive in your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts. See the links on our website. And think about leaving us a rating or review in iTunes or in your podcast app.